Also, we'll take a look at Dr. T's book,
which
is which goes in stores when?
In August.
This coming August. It's called
Yes,
A Guide to Sexual Health and Pleasure. Of course, if I might start with you, let's talk about the study that's showing that women are having children at a later age. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Well, I think what women are saying is it's not so much anymore about biological age, rather it's more about psychological age, in the sense that we are defining ourselves differently, that the ability to bear children is just one of the things that we are capable of as women, that defines us as women. It is not the only thing, and therefore the life also, you know, if you talk about social evolution, we know ourselves from a much deeper and a much broader base than just giving birth. Yeah. And our role is simply just that. So there's a lot more to accomplish. As women are providers rather than, just nurturers. So they nurture more than just the psychological and emotional role, but also financially, materially, and therefore that requires that we spread ourselves and build a sense of self and build a future and build reserves that we are able to provide for our children in a much broader way.
Dr. T, how much of this has got to do with, I suppose, psychological emancipation?
I think it does have a lot to do with it, but also coming from the development side of philanthropy and sexual health and medicine, there is a very deliberate move and shift, especially in campaigning, that's saying to young women in Africa, delay, getting pregnant, finish school, get your tertiary education, finish your internship, and then maybe think about having children. So if you look at how even contraception messaging is sort of designed, it's around delaying the first child. Yeah. Because we do know that research does show that if you have the right social support, if you have the right family support, and not in the typical family unit, but whoever caregivers are around you, women are still much more able to have children younger because they know they can provide for those children. But if, again, as a young woman, you are the sole breadwinner, you are that person who's first entering university or tertiary education, where almost like the entire family is still looking upon you. Yeah. to break the chain, right, of poverty. You do make these very personal choices to delay having children, to give yourself, but also your family, your community, the best chance, of your future. But it is also partly around a deliberate public health messaging. Yeah. That's saying delay fertility. And we can look deeper about, whether that actually works for African black women specifically, who actually need their moms and aunties to still help them raise children. And maybe for us, it's actually still better to have children earlier in our 20s, 30s than much later, when we still have moms and aunties and extended families to take care of our kids.
Mums and aunties are heavily influential when it comes to getting married as well earlier. What do you think the trend is when it comes to African women in terms of getting married at a later stage versus earlier?
I think, again, part of that social evolution is that women are making the decisions more than decisions were made on their behalf, where it would have been so-and-so who decided and so-and-so who chose that this is the person you get married to, and your identity was essentially linked to your ability to bear children, and that was linked very much to your utility value as a person was around that. And so we are defining ourselves differently. We're saying there's more to me than just that. Mm-hmm. And I am making the choice. It is about who I choose to be with, and that what we choose to do in our relationship is more based on what the two of us decide rather than, what society externally is saying needs to happen. So people are owning their own future more than before.
Doc, I want to talk about women's sensuality, if I'm going to put it that way. Do you think there's a lot more openness now in today's society for African women? Are we talking a bit more about it? The politics of pleasure, is it out there in the open?
That's a big one. I think the silencing and policing of women around fertility very much translates around pleasure. Whose bodies is this? Whose body is this supposed to serve? And what does it mean for this body to experience and express pleasure? So I've had patients who are for example, unable to negotiate the type of sex they want to be having because they are scared to be called promiscuous. Where did you learn that? Why do you find that pleasurable? Why are you even interested in sex in the first place? But they're also in the biomedical field. There isn't enough of information given to people about how certain contraceptives, for example, certain medications like your antidepressants, hypertensive medication, can in fact have side effects on pleasure on its own. And so you have a lot of people who are just on medication chronically, feeling that maybe something is not quite okay, but because they are not affirmed as a default by the medical fraternity, it gets hard for people to have those conversations because there's almost like a hierarchy. You know, you sick now, why are you worried about sexual pleasure? Meanwhile, pleasure is a big part of holistic, of wellness, of emotional and physical and psychological wellness too.
Because when we look at... okay, you go first.
I just want to say also that as women, we are owning our bodies more. Whereas before, sex was... Our sexuality and our sensuality was defined as you giving to. It was your role and obligation, more so, to serve the man, because the understanding was that you know, sexuality belongs to the man. You are just there to serve their needs.
So you're just reproductive needs. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're just the oven, the container.
I wanted to talk about that as well when it comes to are women being more aware about their own pleasure. That listen, this is also just about me. I'm going to learn to get pleasure from this particular activity.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, the one big thing that I want to talk about in relation to that is, for example, if you look up at this whole thing about this notion of virginity and so on, and this whole annual thing that happens in the KwaZulu-Natal. If you really think about it, this notion of virginity is not about the woman themselves. It is about the man. Because it is not anything to enhance her. It is about when the man wants you, you must be this. You know, and her whole identity is linked to the hymen.
How do you change that?
You know, there's a whole person behind it. That's totally not. Nobody cares about the person behind it all. You know,
and people who do then speak up get backlash, because I have spoken up around that, and especially the time when it was used as academic merit to determine which young girls are getting bursaries or not. There's a lot of backlash despite the constitution. And I think, you know, again, when young women, when women in general do speak up and break that silence of shame, right? Because often you internalize the shame. Then you become self-loathing. You become self-judging. So even if there's no one in society actively saying things to you, you are already now perpetuating that, right? Because you've learned what it is to be a good woman. And the hope with the book is that the revolution will come, where we will speak freely about our sexual health, our well-being. We will have access to services, because also having good policy and good governance and good, you know, health systems, if people can't access services they need, it's not going to help them. So in the issue of fertility, assisted fertility is a conversation we're not having in South Africa, yet we are talking about LGBTIQ rights. What about transgender women who need to have their DNA stored? What about couples in same-sex marriages? Who's helping them with surrogacy, for example? Is the public health system able to really put money where their mouth is, beyond just policy and LGBTIQ rights, for example?
Now, Kosi, as a clinical psychologist, what matters do you, when a lot of women, I'm sure you deal with a lot of women, also adolescent young girls as well, what sort of matters are you dealing with? What are the common issues that they come and speak to you about when it comes to sexuality?
Well, it is about, you know, do I consent? The thought of sex is about when a man wants it, it means it's got to happen. You know, the sense that, do I have the right to say no? And if I say no, you know, what if he leaves me? And adolescence, there's that sense of that kind of desperation to deliver, to serve, and not owning your own body and not owning your right to decide whether you want to or not, and saying that this is my body. You know, and whatever happens, I need to consent to it. And if I don't, and be willing to pay the price, in the sense that if he's not prepared to wait, then he's not worth your weight either, you know. So, yeah, so women are opening that space to begin to talk about these things earlier than later. You know, and I think also the sense that when people are getting married, there was this whole thing that, you get this whole conversation about your role as a woman, the subservience and so on. Yeah. That we're saying we are more than just that, and we no longer cannot be confined to.
Usually at weddings and African weddings,
yes.
it's the aunts that stand up and say that. It's women that's standing up and telling the other woman to say, listen, this is what you have to be. Yeah. Make sure you cook, make sure you do this. It's always make sure you do everything for your husband. So how do you stop that?
Yeah, the imbalance in power dynamics in relationships are not limited to romantic relationships, right? So there is a certain exertion of power that older folk exert on young people. That's why parents will beat children and call it discipline, right? So power and the abuse of power is non-gendered. The same way that patriarchy is so systemic now that it's non-gendered. And people know that there are benefits to being a good subservient woman who doesn't push the envelope, who's well-behaved. Society rewards those types of people. And therefore, this is why these things get perpetuated, and we need to kind of all act where we act and where we can.
All right, Dr. T, good luck with your book, A Guide to Sexual Health and Pleasure. I like, there's one question in your book here. It says, I think, why the obsession with sex? I just had a quick peek. And I think you go ahead.
Keep reading.
Keep reading. All right, guys, thank you so much for coming through. Sexual and reproductive health, Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, and also Kosi Gianni. She's a clinical psychologist. It's an interesting issue as we are heading into Women's Month.